This is Robert Schwenker, and I'm representing Blue Sky Commons along with Golda Velez, who will be joining us. So today we have a great panel lined up that'll be moderated by Elena Giralt, from whom you just heard. We also are planning out a series of other Blue Sky Community Voices panels in January, February, and the months to come. In January, towards the end, Thursday, the 27th, at noontime Pacific time, PST, we'll be having a panel on moderation as well as reputation. So reputation and moderation will be for January, and we'll be making that announcement soon. So from here, we'll turn it over to Elena, who will introduce the panelists and herself. And we'll also have a Q&A format that'll start approximately in 50 minutes, around 9:50 PST. We'll put some guidelines for questioning in the Twitter spaces. We'll pin it to the space as well. So please get your questions ready. We'll also have a Q&A. Following the Q&A, we'll have a kind of a community discussion if people would like to just make comments to others and such beyond the Q&A period. We'll be recapping this, and we'll post the recordings as we have for the earlier Voices sessions onto YouTube as well. So please feel free to join our Discord, where we have ongoing working groups. So from there, I'll turn it over to Elena. Take it away.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, I guess I'll start by saying happy Friday to everyone. We're close to the end of the year, and this is a good conversation, a good topic as any to round out the Blue Sky community spaces. If you're new to Blue Sky community, this is a series that talks through critical infrastructure needed to build decentralized social media protocols. Today, we're actually continuing a conversation that started last week regarding decentralized data storage. So last week, the conversation focused on peer-to-peer data storage and its role in social media. If those terms are all very new to you, I posted a tweet thread summarizing kind of the highlights of that conversation, and it's a good resource to check out if you want to get caught up for the conversation we're going to have today. So today, we're actually going from decentralized data one level deeper into the world of Web3. In order to do that, we have a world-class panel of blockchain technologists and hopefully a few critics who can give kind of like the devil's advocate side of things to discuss infrastructure and programs required for Web3. And what I mean by Web3 in this context is specifically tokenized, decentralized data storage and web hosting approaches. So before diving into the discussion, I wanted to give our panel the opportunity to introduce themselves. We have David, Nader, Jeromy, and Nick. Maybe you guys can unmute yourselves and let's go around the horn with some rapid fire intros. Maybe we could take about a minute to introduce yourself and your company.
Cool, I'll go first. So my name is David Vorick. I've been working in blockchain for over a decade now, and working on decentralized storage specifically for about 8 years. I'm head of Skynet Labs and lead developer of the Skynet network. I was also lead developer of the Psi network for the first 6 years of its life. And yeah, I'm super excited to be here today.
Hey, I guess I can go next. I'm Jeromy, also usually on the internet known as Why Are You Sleeping? The first employee at Protocol Labs. I built IPFS and Filecoin, and yeah, now I'm really interested in decentralized social and what's next here.
Yes, so I'm Nader. I work with the Graph Protocol and Edge and Node, and we do data indexing, not really dealing directly with these protocols like IPFS and Arweave explicitly, but we do deal a lot with like data indexing and data storage. So I'm excited to be talking about this topic today.
Hi, I'm Nick. I work for a company called Vorick. We're pretty new in the space, but we're doing decentralized private data storage. So unlike most other things, we're around people's private data and how we can make parts of that or insights from that available on chain.
Thank you, guys. And I guess I should introduce myself to round out the panel. My name is Elena. I'm your happy moderator today. I work at Hiro Systems, and we're part of the Stacks ecosystem. And I'm coming to this conversation with very fresh eyes. I actually know very little from the technical stack around decentralized data storage, but I have worked in Web3 for a few years. And one thing that I feel strongly about is that if decentralized applications are reliant on central cloud providers like Amazon Web Services and Google Cloud, we're not really advancing the vision of a user-owned internet that I think is so important to a lot of people working in this space. So for our listeners, I wanted to frame the conversation a little bit so that this could be a discussion that is accessible no matter where you're coming from in terms of your journey in Web3. So let's put things into context. Data storage, this term, has evolved from literally walking a floppy disk over to your friend's desk to where we are today, where entire companies are running in the cloud. Data has never been cheaper to share and store, but the flip side of that is that people are having very little, if any, control or ownership over the data that they produce or that they create or that they share. So the conversation that was had last week, Monsi moderated it, was around decentralized data storage. And the promise of decentralized data storage is that it allows people to own their data and migrate that information over to services where they feel most respected. However, today we're still a far cry from widespread adoption of decentralized protocols like Gun and Scuttlebutt. So that's kind of setting the table for the conversation that I want to have today with the panelists that just introduced themselves. Let's jump right in with the first question. What are the challenges with decentralized peer-to-peer storage, and how might blockchain-based incentive programs and mechanisms like the ones you all work on, how might those address those challenges? This question is open to everybody, so just jump right in.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest problems with decentralized data storage is who actually stores things. Like a lot of people talk about using IPFS for storage, but realistically, IPFS is a protocol for moving data around. And it doesn't really answer the question of where does it actually live. And that's kind of where, this is the reason we built Filecoin, is to provide an answer for where does the data live longer term. And I definitely see blockchains as a way to achieve this more permanent data storage that is, independent from how it gets there. It's an economic guarantee for how it stays around.
So one challenge I'm hearing you say, Jeromy, is like, where does the data live? Another series of challenges I think that were discussed last week were around speed, reliability. So, being able to get decentralized protocols on par or have parity with the user experiences of Web 2. Does anybody else want to chime in on how the blockchain-based incentives they're working on kind of might address those challenges?
Yeah, look, I'll talk about that a little bit. So, I mean, one thing that we see is this big disconnect between the kinds of performances that people get when using Web 2 protocols and traditional databases, and when they're trying to do distributed decentralized storage. That doesn't make for a great user experience. So our approach is to take what would be a traditional database and decentralize it. So it runs on people's devices or in their web browser. And then we use cloud-based synchronization stuff to resync that across multiple places. So we take a very decentralized approach to the data, but then you still get the performance of having a locally running storage node on your device. And we think that gives the best of both worlds there. You get, control over your own data, which is what we're all interested in, as well as this really performant application that works just as well as a Web 2 app. And to come back to the question before around storage location. We can do a lot around that as well. We see we deal a lot in, I guess, enterprise type scenarios where people are coming from a Web 2 environment, and now they're trying to do this, Web 2.5, Web 3 thing where they're just trying to dip their toes into the water, and we're trying to help them get there. But yeah, they have to deal with things like data sovereignty. So we can guarantee the location of the hosting of their data, which is something that a lot of people have problems with when they're dealing with a lot of traditional, in quotes, Web3 solutions that don't offer that type of facility. And we see that quite important when you're dealing with highly regulated industries like health and things like that.
Yeah, I love the ideas of, you have the same data in many different places and you use whatever's closest to you, whether it's locally cached on your device or somewhere else on your local network, or it just happens to be stored in the same city as you.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really the magic of like decentralized data storage in my mind.
So what we've found in operating the Psi network is that often the main barrier for performance with peer-to-peer networks is that the average node on a peer-to-peer network is not that strong. It's from a home connection, whereas at AWS you have these massive data centers that are on internet backbones, and just the hardware, the software, the amount of hops that you have to take is all substantially more optimized. And so our approach in building the Psi network has been, and consequently Skynet has been, why don't we try and set it up and make it so that professionals running inside of data centers, running on backbones, the top tier infrastructure providers in the world are moving from things like AWS into a decentralized network. And how can we structure it so that we have this open competitive marketplace where the network is automatically selecting the highest performing servers and pulling data, distributing data to those servers and pulling data from those servers. And in that, we've found a substantial amount of success. And so Skynet today is running with the average lookup time on a fresh node of about 100 milliseconds to fetch data from the network. So at this point, we're close to AWS speeds, and this is only possible with token payments and incentivizations, because the data is actually coming from professional services, and the only way to get those services interested is to incentivize them, is to pay them for their work.
Yeah, totally. Like the market-based approach is really, really important here.
Yeah, I agree with that totally, David. I think that what you guys have done in Skynet's really interesting. And we're, I guess, getting a lot of inspiration from that around our approach to that. I think latency is another issue that people don't talk about enough. We're in Australia, so we have issues with US-based services just because of that damn speed of light thing. And if you have these, big nodes sitting in a few places, even centralized services have the same problem. You just don't see that performance because of the round trip issues. So the more the better in this approach, and token-based payments do let people from, I guess, non-traditional places participate in that marketplace a lot easier than some other forms of market-based systems.
So to kind of dig in on that a little bit, am I hearing this correctly, that the cryptographic tokens or blockchain-based incentives are really helpful in solving these kind of market-based challenges because they're is basically a payment rail that's more efficient, that you can pay people across the world, as opposed to kind of like a standard way market-based approaches that are more regionally specific or specific to a certain country. Is that what you were referring to, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, we see this all the time in Web3. That's one factor. The cross-border payment solutions is really huge, but also the fact that the tokens are aligned directly with what kind of incentive we're trying to fulfill. So in the storage case, it's relatively simple because it comes down to performance, location, and size type issues. But a lot of other cases, you have to be really careful to make sure that your incentives align perfectly with both what developers want and what the end users need, so you don't end up with things like advertising supported services where the alignments are totally misaligned. The incentives are totally misaligned. Tokenization in general lets you work around that problem. And in the storage case, it's pretty clear that it makes it a lot easier than just your traditional payment rails.
Yeah, I think the token thing is really interesting because at the end of the day, these blockchain systems are paperclip machines. You are setting up a system of incentives for, some kind of paperclip to be created. And the question you have to ask yourself for each of them is what is the paperclip? In Bitcoin, the paperclip is, SHA-2 hashes. It's creating a bunch of SHA-2 hashes. The system we tried to design with Filecoin is bringing more storage to the network. The more, storage you add to the network, the more that, those are the paperclips. And each of these systems spends a lot of time trying to design what that specific mechanism they're optimizing for is. And I mean, that's the key thing about these systems is that they allow you to incentivize something. And then it's up to us to decide what that something is.
I'd like to bring in Nader, also a prolific YouTuber with a lot of different kind of tutorials and how-tos. Something Nick mentioned was, you have a different set of incentives depending on different audiences, whether it's the end user or the developer, or, different providers along the stack. So I was wondering if you might want to talk a little bit about how you see the different players in the ecosystem of decentralized data storage, how their needs might be served based on different incentives.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of thoughts I have here. One is that these types of solutions are kind of not for every type of application. So a lot of times you hear people try to compare S3 with Arweave or something like that, and or even a blockchain. They might try to compare that with something like a SQL database running on a centralized service. Well, they're two completely different use cases. So I think that you have to first take into consideration that the types of applications that people would be building are quite different. Also, I think there's a little bit of misunderstanding and even non-clarity, even to someone like me, around how long this data is persisted on some of these networks. So if I use IPFS or if I use Filecoin or if I even use something like Skynet, how long is that data going to be available? And I don't think that you can go and just read a clear description and give you that answer. Whereas if you have a centralized service, that if you're just paying that monthly bill or whatever, it's going to be there. I think Arweave might be the first real promise, from what I understand, of you just pay one time a transaction and then you're kind of promised that data is going to be available forever. I would love to hear maybe from David around the data availability story around Skynet, or if anyone here from Filecoin or IPFS can kind of give more clarity around truly, immutable data that's going to be available for 10 years from now, right? A lot of the reason we want to use these services is for immutability and that our data is going to be there down the road. But I think a lot of people don't have that guarantee or don't understand how to get that guarantee.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer about it for Skynet. And I think it really comes down to two key ideas for data longevity on Skynet. So the first is that it does work like S3 and that there's a monthly bill that you have to pay. And as long as you're paying that, the data is going to stick around. But then something that S3 doesn't have and perhaps can't even have that Skynet has is this idea of communal ownership of data. So if you think of something like Twitter and a decentralized Twitter, you have all these tweets and all these comments and replies and all of this tiny data floating around. And maybe the original author of the tweet disappears and they stop paying for the storage of their tweet. What Skynet does is that as people browse and as people access data, they pin it themselves into their own incentivized storage. And then so everyone kind of picks up the pieces of the application data and the user data that's important. And so we don't have something like Arweave where we say everything posted to Skynet is definitely going to stick around forever. But we do have good guarantees around data with even very low popularity. As long as like 10 people are looking at a piece of data every single month, then it's a safe bet that that data is going to stick around as long as people are still thinking about it.
Yeah, that's I agree that the general like data sticks around if it's popular is a really useful concept, and IPFS works similarly, where anybody who's seeing a thing running through their own IPFS node will pull it locally and pin it as well. But on the blockchain incentive side, yeah, the Arweave guarantee of you put your data up and it'll somehow magically be sticking around forever, and I don't know if that entirely makes sense, but you can reproduce that with smart contracts and data DAOs on Filecoin, which is something that's in progress right now that we're working on. But the general idea there is the base layer of Filecoin as it exists today is you pay for you make a storage contract with a storage provider, and that persists your data for some amount of time, provably. After that, you have to re-up the deal, but in the future you'll be able to have a smart contract to do that on your behalf, and you'll also be able to allow anybody to contribute to the storage of this data or even this data set. So you can imagine large scale data sets that are important just more generally to humanity could be collectively maintained by people just sending money to a smart contract that persists that over time.
One question that comes to mind, maybe from somebody who has like fresher eyes to the space, is that it seems like a lot of this conversation is centered around data storage, but it feels like, there's a whole ecosystem of things that need to work alongside that. So like you need to have a file system, data transport, data addressing, indexing, like all of these side applications in order to make kind of something like a decentralized social media work in a decentralized context. Can you guys talk a little bit about where you think the kind of biggest challenges is, like the biggest gaps in the space? So it seems like, everyone around here feels pretty confident about like decentralized data storage. If we haven't figured it out entirely, we at least have a good hunch on where to go. But like, what are the unanswered questions in terms of the other parts of the tech stack that need to be built out?
Yeah, so I like that you brought that up. So we designed Saya and implemented Saya in about 9 months. We launched the blockchain, the decentralized incentivized storage layer, in 2015, June of 2015, and since that date, it pretty much hasn't changed. And so the marketplace that we set up has been the same for 6 years now, and obviously we haven't been idle. We have been doing just an enormous amount of work on all of these other elements that are required to make decentralized storage work, and not work, but like be useful to the end user. And so that's where I think Filecoin and Skynet both ended up in the same spot, which we just went opposite directions. Basically, Filecoin started really with IPFS, which is the data transport layer, and Skynet really started with Saya, which is the data storage layer. And then afterwards, IPFS moved into implementing and releasing Filecoin. Saya moved into implementing and releasing Skynet, and they're kind of both packages. You end up in the same spot, and yeah, I guess that's all I have to say at the moment.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. There's definitely a requisite set of things you need to be able to do in order to have a complete ecosystem here. To go a little bit further, though, I think one of the interesting things we've been thinking about is, what are the sets of things you can do with data sets that are actually easier and better in a decentralized context that you can't really do in a centralized one? And like this does come back to one of the things I mentioned earlier, is the idea of a data DAO, where you have some form of governance around a collective, a collection of data. So you have agreement on what's in and out. So this could be like, Wikipedia is kind of a centralized form of this, where you have a very large data set of information, and you have a community that curates and maintains it and agrees on what is the canonical data. And then from there, once you have, a set of governance that agrees on what the data is, a storage network can then store it. And so if this agreement ends up being on chain in some way, then you can have some automated thing that just stores, Wikipedia or any other data set that people decide to maintain. And I think this is a really valuable thing moving forward because, as everybody knows, Wikipedia has all sorts of fun times raising enough money to keep their services online. And that done in a decentralized fashion could be much cheaper for them.
So that's a really great segue to another question that I wanted to talk about, which is, how do communities govern themselves? So if the example you gave, Jeromy, is perfect, like we as a community, like Wikipedia, maybe want to create a decentralized version of Wikipedia, how do we decide, what are the governance models that that people are using to coordinate in all of your respective communities? So I'd love to hear a little bit about governance systems that you think work best and different incentives that you have tried out. And then also if you've seen any challenges. I know if listeners are coming from a Web3 perspective, DAOs are very, very in right now. And yet DAOs have a lot of challenges in terms of, coordinating people and aligning interests. So yeah, let's go around and talk a little bit about that in particular.
Sorry, I just wanted to quickly mention before we moved on to the governance thing about the indexing thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, sorry. We're very interested in that. We do structured data, so traditional database type stuff, document database type things. And that's something that we don't see a lot in decentralized data storage. And that brings a whole set of other problems, things like querying your data. If you have to walk across decentralized nodes in order to find a particular piece of data, it's really slow. It doesn't work well. So you really need to do things differently. You need to have proper indexes. My background is in data, run an AI company and done that type of stuff before. And the idea of being able to build structured collections of data from numerous different sources, have consistent metadata, and be able to run deep queries that you would on a traditional SQL-based database or something like Mongo against that data is something that you really need to build consumer-facing applications that go beyond things like just serving images. So we're in that space, and that's something that we see a lot of potential for because you do that in Web 2 world, so why not bring it to Web 3? But yeah, back to governance and I think I'll let other people talk about that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'd actually like to chime in really quick on that last point, and then I can also speak to governance because I'm doing a lot of that in Developer DAO. I see Ryan, coordinator, in here. He's helping us out there as well. He's done a lot of that. But around indexing and querying, yeah, that's kind of like the big, I would say, elephant in the room when you talk about a lot of this stuff. Because when you build out on top of all these building blocks, where's the compute layer? And how can you build a compute layer for serving up the types of queries where you might need relational data or full text search or filtering or sorting? All of these things that we're so used to just having extremely easy access to in the Web 2 world are essentially just non-existent directly from the protocol layer for the most part. There are some interesting things out there like Ceramic that are maybe approaching this in interesting ways, but it's only for their network and it's not really for other networks. And that's kind of the stuff that we're working on at the Graph protocol, that we offer a decentralized indexing and querying layer that not only indexes and kind of serves this data up from a database, but it also gives you the security guarantees that you would expect directly from the chain. So it's super easy, I guess, if you just wanted to throw a who's to guarantee that that's the actual data that is on chain. So you build, to make this actually work, you need to build some type of incentive mechanism that basically will incentivize people to serve the right data and also de-incentivize or slash the people serving the wrong data. And if you're interested in kind of how that would look, the Graph protocol is just exactly that in practice.
Well, it seems like querying and indexing is something like I think we should stick on that topic if it's something that there are several other points that we want to make. I think Nader, what you just mentioned, the challenge of incentivizing people to kind of behave the way you want them to, or do serve good data, and then disincentivize people who are serving the wrong information. Can you talk a little bit about what incentive mechanisms you're seeing work? Or it would also be helpful, I think, to share with the audience anything that you've tried out that didn't work. I think in a lot of contexts, people are walking into this and hearing a lot of jargon, like data, decentralized, incentivized, tokens, and it's hard to kind of really understand literally what does that mean. Did you pay people more in one context and see that was gamed, or did you try something out? How hard was it to pivot and try a different strategy?
Yeah, I mean, really the Graph protocol is a decentralized network that is governed, and it's functioning due to different types of participants that are incentivized by a tokenized incentive mechanism. So you have different people that can participate in this. So if you just wanted to, again, throw up a database somewhere in a centralized space, that that's going to work, and you kind of rely on that service to provide the best service at the best price or whatever you're paying. But in a network, you have to essentially try to make all of these people work together and build out and serve these types of queries up in a way that is, I would say, reliable, and also that works the best for all of the people that are consuming those different APIs. So in the Graph, we have indexers that are basically people running the decentralized infrastructure, running their own node. So almost like how in Ethereum you might run a node, and the Graph, we have these Graph nodes where people can run their own indexer. And then we have also developers that want to build out APIs. And if you're a developer, you might kind of decide, oh, I want to look at this smart contract and I want to expose this data. And then I would deploy my API or my subgraph to the network. And therefore, I want some indexer to pick that up and start indexing that data and making it available. So how does an indexer decide which subgraph to pick up? Well, there is this curation mechanism where people that hold tokens can signal to an indexer that this subgraph is important to them. So they'll stake some tokens into a API or a subgraph, and then an indexer will see, okay, this subgraph or this API is valuable, therefore I'm going to index it. And then once that indexer decides to start indexing that data and making it available for querying, then there are also incentives in place for people to then go and inspect the data that indexer is indexing and querying, or being made available for querying. And if they're doing anything malicious, then they can essentially kind of signal that this is a malicious actor, and we need to kind of come to a consensus around whether this is true, that what I'm saying is true or not. And if they are serving the wrong types of data, then they are de-incentivized through a slashing mechanism, where the tokens that they kind of use to stake and set up their indexing are taken away from them. So it's kind of all around tokens and using them to incentivize and de-incentivize people within the network.
Nader, that's really interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about that, I guess, malicious actor detection approach? How does so that's done via DAO, is it? Or how does that actually work there?
Yeah, it's essentially a DAO. I believe they're called, we call them fishermen or something like that, where they're essentially kind of going out there and looking for ways, or looking for people that are kind of doing this. And if they find someone that is, then they are incentivized as well, because if they find someone that is acting in a malicious way, then they actually receive a reward for doing that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, we see, I guess, the developers as being a key part of this ecosystem. So trying to find ways to incentivize them to build applications that bring more people and their data onto the network is a key part of our approach. So aligning the tokens to both users and developers who are using that data is something that we're doing now. But the malicious actor thing is something that I think it's an increasing problem in Web3. Like we've seen it destroy Web2 services in some cases, and approaches to that is something that's pretty interesting. I think there needs to be a lot more work in that area.
Yeah, I'm curious. Do you see the way forward as being actually a pay per query type approach, or do you have some amount of altruism on like the nodes serving data here?
Well, basically, once a subgraph or an API is kind of like on the network, then the indexers will compete to kind of serve the best the best service kind of at the best price, I guess you could say. But if you look at something like AWS and serverless, which I feel like a lot of the ideas behind serverless computing are actually also things that we are doing in the Web3 world with these protocols that are kind of like providing a service. Like in the case that we're talking about, it's a storage service. With something like AWS Lambda, you would just pay X pennies per query or per I guess you could say per query or per transaction is what I'm so used to saying in this world. But yeah, so every time you would hit that endpoint on AWS Lambda, they are kind of managing all the infrastructure for you. All you have to do is just kind of set up this endpoint, write your business logic, and then you now have this endpoint that you can use. And then if you hit it 1 million times, you might pay like $1. So that's kind of how the same pricing model that we're taking into consideration, and that's kind of how it works today. The indexer is determining the price, and you might pay like $1 for every like 1 million queries or something like that. But it's kind of in that same pricing model as something like a serverless service would offer.
Yeah, as I've been thinking through this, there's kind of this weird thing where if you make a user pay per thing they do, like imagine if every time you refresh the Twitter feed or you did a Twitter search that like cost you some money, even if it was some infinitesimal amount of money, it's still there. And like that psychological barrier has a weird chilling effect on people, that they're less likely to interact and engage with a thing if they're aware that they're paying every time they do a little thing. I've been really interested in trying to figure out how to make more subscription model type things work, where you pay, a certain amount for the use of the service, and then, get to use the service. The problem with that is if you remove the pay per the interaction thing, you kind of remove some of the incentive of the service providers of providing a good service necessarily. I'm curious if anybody has thought about actually pricing models in Web3.
Yeah, so I think that I'm actually going to push back on the way that pay per request influences user behavior, because we have plenty of examples of pay per request working in the real world. Probably the most expensive example would be gasoline. Every time you start your car, it costs maybe a nickel, and then for every mile you drive, it costs maybe 15, 20 cents. And that is something people think about, but it's not this like crazy psychological barrier that makes it challenging to get to the grocery store. You just know it's part of the budget. But other examples of this would be like water, natural gas, electricity, and then of course a big one would be mobile data plans. And so I do think that it's completely reasonable to build a pay-as-you-go system as long as there's a general sense of a user can have confidence at the end of the month whether the bill is going to be $20 or $60, and then they can also have confidence that it's definitely not going to be, say, $200. And so on Skynet, we've really tried to structure the usage mechanism to feel like that. And we do also offer a monthly subscription, so users can just pay like say $20 a month and get unlimited access to the network at a certain speed. But I do think eventually we'll be able to move on to just the sort of continuous thing. Another example where this kind of works is the App Store, which is not strictly continuous, but you do have this like users are prompted to pay continuously, and largely it's been super successful. People are happy to dump a ton of money into the App Store every month.
I mean,
Yeah,
app stores in general, you have. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say that I think Nader mentioned AWS Lambda, which I think is a great example of this kind of service where people pay per usage, and
Well, the provider
there's always
pays
this
per
risk.
usage,
Yeah, that's right. And
not
so,
the user. The user doesn't pay per usage
well,
there.
that's
So like,
true, but there's still the friction. You know, the first time you use Lambda, you're like, oh, how much is this going to cost me? And then after a while, you're like, yeah, it's pretty predictable, and you sort of begin to trust the predictability. And users will subscribe to things. Users pay per things, like the examples that were given before. There is definitely a friction that you need to overcome the first time, but I think as an ongoing thing, once you've gotten over that, people were sort of used to it.
It sounds like the conversation is kind of centering around, having to change existing mental models. And so like previously, a lot of Web 2, like we're talking about pricing models, we're talking about expectations from providers versus end users. Like in Web 2, so many of the business models and market incentives were contingent on people collecting, aggregating, and then repackaging data. And so there you see companies that like make it really frictionless to like refresh and give your information and kind of like dump it all in one place, because the centralized providers would then repackage that information and sell it to people. In Web3 with blockchain-based incentives, my kind of layman's understanding is that there's going to be like a new way to incentivize people so that you have a better experience overall, right? Like you have more control over your information. You're not as reliant on central providers, and you can port from one place to another. I think now, like looking at the clock, it would be interesting to hear a little bit about how you think kind of these blockchain-based incentives would work in a world like social media, where you want to see your friends' information, or you want to be served relevant information in your feed around maybe a particular show you want to see, or shoes you want to buy, or presents you want to get for the holidays. Like what mental models will change in a decentralized social media world given blockchain-based incentives for decentralized data storage? And then I know that was a long-winded question, but if people also have time, I think it's worth also revisiting what governance models look like.
Yeah,
I think it's kind of yet to. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in kind of at you mentioned like changing user behavior, but I think what's more interesting in decentralized data is the way it changes developer behavior. And the way Web 2 works right now is that all user data is in these various silos that you can't move between. And so, for example, Twitter has all the tweets, has all the DMs, has all the information about likes. And if you decide that you don't like as either an influencer or as a user, that you don't like some of the, say, content moderation policies, or some of the front end changes, or some of the algorithm changes, if you don't like what's showing up in your feed or how that decision's being made, your only recourse is to leave both the platform and the data. And so there is no like, oh, I'll just make my own algorithm to construct my feed and then use that, because Twitter's not going to give you the data about the tweets so that you can search and build your own feed. But when we switch to these decentralized data models, the data is kind of all pooled into the same location. And so when I switch from decentralized Twitter A to Twitter's competitor, decentralized Mastodon, in a fully decentralized context, the developers in Mastodon still can see all of my previous tweets. They can still see all of my followers. They can still publish data in a way that my previous followers who did not switch to Mastodon can see the tweets that I'm making on Mastodon. And of course, this extends far beyond Twitter. You can do this with YouTube and with TikTok and with Discord. And so the advantage of Web3, and I think what really compels us at Skynet as a team, is that we can crack open these APIs and make it so that rather than locking into a single service, we can take all of these valuable pieces from different platforms, and we can play with them and put them together in different ways.
Yeah, it's entirely about ownership of the data and where the data gets to live. And like users are in control in Web3, where the services are in control in Web2. Breaking that up is kind of the whole point.
Yeah, I kind of wonder if we're going to see the in the future with these new social media platforms that will hopefully come soon. I think that in my head that we see them subsidizing some of this stuff. I mean, I think we're going to see completely new models around monetization in the first place. And I wouldn't doubt that we will see them subsidizing, storage costs for their users, and instead having a different type of monetization, idea around how they think of money in the first place, or even incentivizing the users really in the first place.
Yeah.
I just want to talk a little bit about Elena's, new ways of dealing with thinking about social media a little bit there. We think of it a bit about what Patreon's done in that area. Lets very popular people make very large amounts of money from effectively subscribing, and we sort of see that as them tokenizing their popularity, although it's not sort of done that way yet. And I don't see any reason why people can't do that in the future. Like if they tokenize their ability to follow people, that lets you sort of put a price on this popularity. And we think that can be quite an interesting model for content creators and the people who are running these large social media channels. In a Web3 world, there should be a way for them to monetize that that doesn't necessarily rely on advertising. And we hope to kind of enable that type of thing. And I think a lot of people working in this space are looking at the same types of models like that.
So I did want to quickly address one thing Nader brought up, which is like paying for the infrastructure costs. So applications paying for the storage of their users. And I think this is a common, easy pitfall to hit with decentralization, where if you aren't the one paying for your infrastructure yourself, then you are dependent on whoever is paying for it. And so if you have this situation where, say, like the dev team is subsidizing the use of the network, that means that if the dev team walks away, the community falls apart. And so it's really important if you're designing something that you want to be fully independent and decentralized, it needs to be self-funded. And so that could be, a community funding itself, or if you want to be an individual, then as an individual, you have to fund yourself. And so I just wanted to bring that up because I think I see a lot of teams discussing, how do we pay for the bandwidth so that our users don't have to? And yeah, it's like if you're paying for the bandwidth, then your users cannot survive without you. And the whole point of decentralization is to give your users optionality, so that if they, in the future decide they don't like you, they can leave, and they don't lose the applications that they've come to depend on, and they don't lose the connections that they've made, and so on.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting point here around like what is dangerous to subsidize versus what is not, and it comes down to a very fine line. Like it's should be fine for people to subsidize for their app the storage of data as long as it's a copy. It's a copy on a CDN, for example, where the primary copy of that data is still hosted by the user in some other way. Like subsidies for optimizations are fine when without those optimizations, things would still work well.
And for people in the back who might not know, CDN stands for what?
Content delivery network. So most of the internet today is actually cached by these CDNs. You rarely on big web pages load data from the source. You load it from something that has cached the source according to the rules set out by the source.
Yeah, I think so. This could be like a whole nother rabbit hole, but one thing that I think about a lot in Web3 is what are we trying to optimize for? And, there's always trade-offs. If people present the world of Web3 as a world without trade-offs, we're kind of like doing a disservice to to the industry and really to people who are excited about the possibilities that Web3 promises. One thing, based on what I'm hearing from all of you say, this like new, not pay to play, but like kind of passing on the friction of payment to maybe developers or end users, or not in a centralized hub, is like one of the things. It's like, who do you want on your network? And so one of the benefits in the early days of Web 2 was kind of this digital space where everybody could meet and internet was shared. And then, you know, like in the height of the Arab Spring, if people remember, this was like 2010, 2011. One exciting thing was the internet promised a space where everyone could participate equally. And that's mostly because these platforms let everybody participate for free, so that they could then like package and resell their data. In a Web3 world where even if it's infinitesimal payment friction that gets passed on to the developers or users, that will have, or I assume that will result in certain trade-offs in terms of what the internet feels like in the future. You know, you're looking at like, are different people getting censored in more authoritarian regimes? Will people be censored just because they can't afford to participate in a certain economy or a certain digital space versus another? That's just kind of a little reaction that I had. In the 10 minutes that we have left, do we want to jump into governance, or maybe somebody from the panel, if there's a topic we haven't hit on and you think it's important, please feel free to throw it in.
I can go ahead and hit on governance. So we really like to look at governance as off-chain as possible. I think there's a tendency of the ecosystem to jump to things like DAOs, or to jump to things like proposals and EIPs, and try and figure out how to do things in this very coordinated, not centralized, but like, you know, have one platform, one set of rules that everyone has to follow. But I think you get a much better experience if, as much as possible, you take the rulemaking and you put it as far down the stack as possible, like as close to the user as possible. And so on Skynet, we have this concept of a DAC, which is a data access controller. And that's kind of our analog to data governance. It's basically some developer saying, I'm gonna make a set of data. And for example, the data might be profile information. So it'll have like an avatar and my preferred username and where I live and a tagline, something like that. And there will be a single application that manages that data and has control over it. And so no other application can touch that data. But the application that does control the data will expose an API that allows other applications to either read and write to it according to whatever set of internal logic. And so this is kind of similar to how Ceramic works, except that because we're wrapping everything in APIs, the amount of coordination that you need to allow different people to come up with different structures for managing data and passing data around and essentially governing the shape of data on Skynet. It's just a much more robust and like easy to use system. So let me know if that is a satisfying answer, if that's not really what you're getting at with governance.
Oh, that's perfect. I'd love to hear in other ecosystems kind of the approach, or like what you're prioritizing, or what you'd love to see in terms of governance.
Yeah, over in the IPFS and Filecoin side of things, we generally take the approach that users are somewhat responsible for picking their own, sets, what they serve and what they rehost to other people. And towards that, we ourselves maintain lists of things that, lists of hashes that are, not to be served by our gateways, for example. And different groups maintain lists of hashes that are, things that miners probably shouldn't store in different countries. And, you generally have these set up as double hashes, so you can't just use it as a list of things to go download. But the idea here is it's entirely opt-in. So you choose what to respect based on what makes sense to you. It's, really a pushing governance out to the edges of you decide what the right thing for you is. And there's probably easy to find reasonable defaults for you to respect based on where you live or what jurisdiction that is.
Yeah, I mean, we've at Developer DAO, it's a DAO that was started about 3.5 months ago or so, and it's my first experience kind of in all of this, voting and governance and stuff like this. So I'm still learning a lot, but it's been really interesting, and I have been just keeping an eye on other DAOs and the way that they work. And you have DAOs and you have organizations with anywhere between like a handful of people to tens of thousands of people. So if you look in some of the ENS governance forums, it's really interesting to see the conversations that are happening there around people that are agreeing and disagreeing on stuff. And I think that governance, based on everything that I've learned, is one of the most complicated things in this entire space, believe it or not, around we have this idea of decentralization, and a lot of times people create these DAOs and these organizations to kind of decentralize what we are trying to get away from, right? But in reality, it's a lot harder than anyone wants to kind of admit sometimes. So I think that we have ways of doing things that are not ideal in the for what we would like, but they're better than what we had before, right? So in the past, Facebook would make decisions and all of these things, and we had zero voice in how that was working. But at least today we have, in most of these decentralized organizations, we have at least some voice, but we're not kind of there yet on what's the ideal way to do this. So you have things like token and coin voting governance, and you even have people that are leaders in the community like Vitalik that are kind of writing blog posts that are saying that this is not good. We need to kind of move beyond this. To me, though, like just based on what I've learned so far, I think that an ideal way for something like a DAO, at least to operate, is to kind of maybe have a combination of token governance along with reputation, along with participation. So how do you combine those three things? I don't think we have the answer for that yet, but I'm hoping we'll see some tooling and protocols maybe that can help figure that out in the future.
All right, Blue Sky community, I hope you're listening. That was a really lofty challenge that Nader just put on everybody, but I think it couldn't be more important and relevant. I think like with a lot of these Web3 technologies, people want control and ownership over either their data or their digital tools, and yet, with great power comes great responsibility, or at least some like small modicum of engagement, I think is what we're really hoping for. All right, we have a few minutes left. I think it's time for a lightning round before we move into Q&A. I had one like little lightning round question I want to ask, and it was on the tip of my tongue and it just escapes me. But maybe we could start with like a very low ball. What does success look like in like what are y'all most excited about in the next year? Either in your ecosystem or in blockchain incentivized data storage in general. I remember what I was going to say. For governance, if there's anybody listening, like don't feel like you need to be the most technical person in the room. This is a huge issue all around Web3. How do you get people engaged and informed so that they can meaningfully and constructively participate? I'd invite all of you to like dust off your poli-sci degrees if that's what you chose to study in school, because it is really useful and that perspective would be valuable. Okay, I've eaten up most of our lightning round. I would like to throw it back to the panelists. Why don't we do what does success look like in the next year and in the future for each of your ecosystems?
I mean, from my end, success in the Filecoin and IPFS ecosystem looks like the development of very efficient markets for storage and like retrieval of data, effectively a fast CDN that beats out, Web2 CDNs.
I would say for the Skynet ecosystem, we really success for me would be, a YouTube creator that can post a video and isn't worried about saying the word COVID, isn't thinking about demonetization, and can just be themselves and be true to their audience. And I think the internet today has lost that. And so we're building towards a world where you and your audience are what counts, and that faceless corporation, hanging over you is not a thing anymore. We want to pull that away.
I guess for me, it's where people start using these Web3 storage APIs instead of Web 2 because they work better. I want to see that happen rather than any particular, lofty goals for the company. I think just the ability for people to substitute and see that these work really well is really, really interesting.
Yeah, +1 on that. That's a great goal. And just in general, for me as a developer, I would love to see the barrier to entry to kind of start building on all this stuff, the user experience, the developer experience improve over the next year. I think everyone's working on that. We've seen some of the best talent in the entire world kind of move into this space in the last 6 months. We've seen a lot of money come into this space. So I'm looking forward to seeing where we are a year from now.
Awesome. Well, to all the panelists, thank you so much for chiming in, for sharing your perspective. We'll move into Q&A now, and I think, Robert, you will be moderating that. I just wanted to take a moment to thank all the listeners for joining this Twitter space. Of course, thank the panelists. Your insights were very interesting, and I think it's a conversation we'll be hearing more of in the years to come, months to come, probably. And then, also thank Bluesky Community for hosting us. So with that, Robert, I'll hand it back to you, and we'll move into Q&A.